Okay, so here we go. The first thing to consider as we engage in the practice is what we've already discussed, which is our motivation. And the baseline motivation is at least a caring for our own well-being. And that is, in one of his talks several years ago, the Dalai Lama said that the fundamental impulse or the fundamental drive of human beings is actually caring. And of course, this caring can be simply directed to oneself. Typically, with most people, it's directed to themselves and then to their loved ones. But that is the fundamental thing driving people, caring. And sometimes that caring, when it's limited to a specific circle of people, it can cause someone to even be violent to someone else. It can cause someone to try and cheat someone out of something. So it can cause us to do negative deeds to others based in our own caring. But still, that fundamental drive is the caring. So in many ways, the spiritual path is a process of nurturing that little seedling of caring that we hold, at least for our own self and for those close to us, and begin to not only expand that caring out beyond our small circle of influence and of connectivity, but out to all beings, all things, out through the entirety of existence. And not only do we care, not only is it like, sending out love to all beings, but it becomes something deeper than that, which is the desire to be totally free of suffering and to really see into the true causes of suffering, into the nature of reality, and to become completely enlightened with the understanding that if we become completely enlightened, then we can be of ultimate benefit to all beings. So then our caring, the caring that we had, the desire, the original baseline desire we had for our own well-being and for the well-being of others, and hopefully expanding that out as far as we can, then that actually, there's some real basis to that. If one can achieve enlightenment or even just progress along the path, think about how much more benefit you can bring to yourself and to others. And so this is a phrase that's often talked about in the path of accomplishing one's own purpose and accomplishing that of others. And we may have heard the analogy of the oxygen mask on an airplane, put your mask on before helping others. And we have to be careful with that because it's not a self-centered approach to practice, but we do understand that if we run out into the world with our mind fully a mess, then we're not really going to be a force of enlightenment and of relieving suffering in the world. We'll probably just add to it. And that's not to say we have to wait until we're completely enlightened to act for the benefit of beings and to be altruistic and act in the world. But you see the trajectory here. And so that little seedling of caring, which is actually a sort of a ray of the sun, which is your Buddha nature. So this is an idea in Buddhism, and it is in other religions as well. You are made in the image of the divine and the image of God, so on and so forth. And many of the mystics of the Sufism and other traditions have had the realization that they and God are inseparable. There's one phrase from the Sufi tradition. This mystic said, "I am God," and in that moment, he was not lying. And so obviously it wasn't his small self that was God, but it was a full identification of his most profound sense, which is profound self, which in the Buddhist tradition is your Buddha nature. And that Buddha nature is actually perfectly complete in this moment from one perspective. But because we're living up here metaphorically, in our conventional mind, stuck in concepts, stuck in the matrix of conceptuality and reification of self and other and of world, we're not able to see that. But if we drop our awareness down into the very base of our being, into the very ground of our being, on that level and from that perspective, our Buddha nature is already totally complete and perfect, just as it is. And as such, reality is complete and perfect, just as it is. And because of that, we have these two trajectories of the path. On the one hand, there's this gradual path of a sentient being, of an ordinary being moving along the stages of the path. And on the other hand, there is always permeating through the whole path this total perfection that we can tap into at any time if we can access that perspective. So if we access the perspective of our Buddha mind, everything is perfect. But as long as we are walking along in our sentient being's mind, in our ordinary being's mind, then there's going to be a path and there's going to be struggle. And that's not to say, oh, now that I see that, now that I hear that there's this Buddha perspective, I'm just going to kick the ladder out and totally abandon the path. That's not the idea. The idea is actually that we actually commit to the path and commit to walking the path, but we pepper it and we see at each stage of the path. We try and see through to the ground, and we still keep working, but then we see through to the ground again. So it's this idea of being there while getting there. So that being said, this Buddha nature, the reflection of it is this initial caring. And it's a small caring when it is obscured by many factors and the sense of trying to protect oneself and one's loved ones. So then at that time, this Buddha nature is actually quite small. And so as we progress, this little seedling expands until finally this Buddha nature has become a completely enlightened Buddha. So that is the nature, that is the beginning of the path, and that it has within it, a point there is that within that very beginning, that initial caring that brought us to the path, that brought us to the teaching, that is your Buddha nature speaking to you. That is your Buddha nature guiding you towards the path of liberation. And so that brings us to the next point, which is this caring has to be in response to something. And this desire for liberation has to be in response to something, which essentially is the fact that we're not liberated right now. In other words, we are suffering right now. And it is that suffering that is actually, in most cases, the beginning of the path. Because if everything's going perfectly well, and if everything seems fine, kind of, not tremendous, not extraordinary, or maybe even, maybe you're a millionaire living in an amazing house and you've got jets and you've got this, that, and the other, and you're just cruising and it feels like, how could it get better than this? And in the Buddhist context, we talk about this as like kind of the Deva realm, this realm of beings where everything is just, there's nectar and everyone's naked and everything's yummy and it's just grapes and wine, and it's like the party's never going to end. And I think we can see that even in the human realm, there are people who live that way. It seems like this good time is never going to end. And a lot of times there's a group of people living that way, and then everybody else is trying to get that. And what, of course, they don't understand is that the problem with that area of existence is that things may seem really wonderful now, but from a karmic perspective, that is the ripening of karma. In other words, that the good times are a ripening of karma, and that karma is being burned. But because you're having such a good time, you're not even considering the nature of your existence or the path of liberation. Because you feel like, in a way, you've already made it. You've already been liberated. You're in this beautiful Deva realm. You're, in the mansion in Beverly Hills, surrounded by delicious food and friends and all of that. And so there's no impetus to engage in spiritual practice. But of course, that karma will eventually burn out. And at that point, there will be a fall from that Deva existence. And we've seen this happen to so many people, even on the human realm, of being the rock star, living it up, all of that. The karma is coming through, all the yummy karma, and then boom, just a total collapse. And some of them, fortunately, I think of Jim Carrey actually in this example, they have a realization, and they really come to, they're able to cut through their privilege. They're able to cut through this delicious Deva realm and actually come to something that's going to be enduring. Because again, like we talked about before, none of that deliciousness is going to come with us after this life, and we may even lose it in this life. So if you are not a Deva, that could be one thing, and you're not someone who is just intent on becoming a Deva, or one of these human beings living a Deva-like life, then you are probably experiencing some level of suffering. And it was the Buddha's first teaching that he identified not a new discovery, but a level of this discovery that is far more nuanced and profound than what we know, which is that life is suffering. Okay, our existence as it is, the way we exist within a duality structure, where we are reifying self and other, and we are caught between attachment and aversion, and we are not seeing our true nature, that is suffering. And again, like I said, if you're one of these Deva realms, you can kind of avoid that a little bit because you're having such a great time. But sooner or later, we come to this point. And so typically, it's no surprise that people arrive at the gates of the spiritual path, so to speak, after some deep suffering. And of course, now we're experiencing a collective suffering, or at least a deeply collective concern. And of course, some people are in the front lines and, just profound suffering. But for us, who are at home and not fully on the front lines, at least there's this questioning of things. And so it's kind of a realization, whoa, life is really unstable. And I'm not suffering that much right now, but boy, I could get coronavirus any second, and of course, this is always the case. I could get in a car accident every second. I could come down with cancer every second. I could, get hit by a car, or anything. And of course, in the Buddhist tradition, we try to live with that constant awareness of the impermanence of life. So whatever it might be, we come typically to the path based in our suffering. And I'll speak to my own experience in this, which is that's 100% how I came to the path. I reached a point where I knew the path that I was on was only going to lead to more suffering, and I couldn't see a way out of this suffering. I got very in college. I think in an attempt to find some deeper meaning in my life, I began partying, and then eventually I found psychedelics, and it was when I started doing psychedelic drugs that I had some insight into, on the one hand, a deeper love than I had ever experienced before, and on the other hand, a deeper insight into consciousness and the nature of reality and sort of the unreality of myself. And I've heard a lot of people discuss that. You may know Ram Dass, formerly Dr. Richard Alpert of Harvard, who, he talks about his acid experiences. And in his acid experiences, what would happen is that his sense of separation between himself and the rest of the world, his sense of an ego identity, would begin to dissolve away. And he would be sort of floating in this vast ocean of consciousness in a way. And that is very reminiscent of the descriptions of cosmic consciousness or primordial consciousness that's described in the mystical traditions. And so, I had some experiences along these lines. And fortunately, I had some intuition that while these drugs were revealing something, they weren't the path. I knew there would be a burnout if I took that path. And not everyone realizes that, and then they can become not just an awakening, but actually a very destructive path. And in some ways, it almost did for me. And it took me deeper and deeper into partying, and it was very difficult to untangle the enlightening aspects of these drugs and these experiences and the stuff that was just partying, just nonsense, really. I'm just burning off steam, just kind of being confused. And that's what I was, and that's what, in Buddhism, one of the primary mental affliction is just this confusion, not knowing what's up with our existence. How do things really exist? What's going on? And a lot of times then that manifests in crazy behavior or depression, or or some people just put it in a box and stow it away, and they just decide never to worry about it until their midlife crisis or their divorce or whatever, or the moment of their death, or when a crisis hits or something, and then they pull it out and okay, I need to ask that question. But long story short, I was asking those questions, and then finally I hit rock bottom. I was going too fast. I was out of control. And fortunately, I had my come to Jesus moment. And it wasn't literally Jesus, but in a way it was, where I said, I need to do something drastically different. And one of the things I need to do is I need to stop listening to Joe. I need to stop listening to this mind that's running its mouth and that's giving me all these stupid ideas. I need to listen to something that's deeper than that. And in that moment, somehow, I had this feeling, this idea in my mind that was like, you already know what to do. On some deep level, you know the path. You know the way of virtue, of righteousness. You know how to be good. You were born with that knowing. But for some reason, you had to try out all this other crap. You had to just spin your wheel. You had to make sure that, oh yeah, that really was the dark side. You had to really test it for yourself. You couldn't take, other people's word for it. And that's exactly what it was for me. It's like I had to see for myself. And I saw. I saw. And it's not fun. And it doesn't lead anywhere good. And so fortunately, I had the wherewithal to take up meditation and yoga. And initially it was from an Esquire magazine in my dad's office. That was a 15-minute breathing meditation. And then I joined Core Power Yoga, which totally transformed my body and got my energy working a whole other way. I was a football player. I was like super tight and everything, and it totally opened things up for me. So that suffering that I was experiencing brought me into the path. And I began searching for a way out of this suffering. And so the Buddha taught 4 noble truths to begin his 40 years of teaching after his enlightenment. And the first truth is there is suffering. And in some ways it's like all of existence as we currently live it is suffering. It's not suffering like some days I have good days, some days I have bad days. That wasn't the suffering he was talking about. He was talking about actually built into the very nature of existing is this suffering, which is this misapprehension of 2 very important things. One, we are, and these fall into the category of ignorance, unknowing, confusion, so on. On the one hand, we fundamentally misidentify. We take that which is not I or mine, and we believe that it is I or mine. We believe this body is mine, this mind is mine, that's who I really am, or this thing, this lamp is mine, so on and so, this phone is mine, so on, these people are mine, and we cling, and that clinging and that identification creates suffering, because it's not based in reality. And then the second part of that is that while we misidentify with the mind, with the body, with all these things that is not really who you are, we fail to identify that which we really are, which is primordial consciousness, Buddha mind, God, the ground of being, your true nature. And so those 2 factors are inherently suffering, because when we are identifying with this body and this mind, this body and mind are going to suffer. Old age, sickness, and death, and the mind, you know the mind. It's going to be all over the place. And so if we're identified with that, when is this peace going to come? Do we really think there's going to be a time when we're going to get our body, our mind, and our external environment all perfect, and we're just going to seal it like that, and then it's just going to be, got it. That's never going to happen. It is always going to be an up and down with the mind and with the external environment and our bodies until complete enlightenment. And so we can't rely on that as a veritable source of well-being. And so we have to come into contact with something that transcends that. And the first part of that is actually identifying that that's not who we are. You're not your thoughts, you're not your body, you're not any of the things in your external environment. So that was the first truth. the truth of suffering, which we'll return to in a second. The second is, what is the cause of suffering? We've just talked about that. And fundamentally, this misidentification then leads to the next thing, and it actually is imbued with the same thing, which is grasping. We grasp onto I and mine, right? And then that creates this clinging, and that is the source of suffering. And it's both the clinging to good experiences and the sort of clinging to not go into the direction of bad experiences, of suffering, of things that are we would call adversity. And so another word for suffering, we could think of it as sort of this existential angst of just never finding rest. You know, it's not like, ow, I cut myself. That is a form of suffering, but this is, you can see, this is a deeper form of suffering. This is just this pervasive sense of suffering that we've just always felt, and it's based on this grasping stemming from unknowing. And so then the third truth that he taught was that there is actually a way to be free of this suffering. There is an antidote, which on the most fundamental level is the release of grasping and the identification of who we really are. And then the fourth truth was that there is a path that leads from where you are now to freedom from suffering. Okay? And that is the spiritual path. That's what we're here for. That's what we're engaging on. So let's dive a little bit more deeply into suffering. Okay. So we'll take a little break and then we'll dive into suffering.